So our next session is going to take a closer look at the precarity and the instability that often goes hand in hand with that kind of work. And our speakers are going to ask how we might be able to overcome that precarity so that workers and firms can reap all of the potential benefits that come from innovative work arrangements, but without leaving anyone behind. So we'll first hear from Laura Lamb, who is a researcher at the University of Toronto, and she'll share her insights and highlights from her latest Brave New Work paper on navigating precarity in non-standard work. And then we'll turn the floor over to Jeanette Campbell and Alex Mazer to bring some of these issues to life for us. Jeanette Campbell is the CEO of the Ontario Disability Employment Network, and she'll offer some of her own reflections about what non-standard work and precarity can look like for people with disabilities. And Alex Mazer is the co-founder and co-CEO of Commonwealth Retirement, and he'll share his story about starting a portable benefits company, arguably to fill a gap, or at least one gap, that's left by a policy and economic landscape that wasn't really designed with non-standard work in mind. And of course, at the end of the session, we'll have an opportunity for questions from the audience as well. So please do keep those coming throughout. So let's jump back in. Laura, it's so great to have you here. I'll hand the stage over to you now.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm speaking to you here from Toronto, Ontario, where Toronto is in the District 1 Queen Territory, the treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee, and on which the land that I'm privileged to be an immigrant and to live on and work on right now. I just want to thank this Public Policy Forum for inviting me here today to discuss this really messy space within the messy middle and allow me to critically reflect on this topic through the recommendations and some of the realities. And I'm really excited to get to discuss with all of you here today. And it's a topic that has been very near and dear to me, not just as a researcher, but because I know people that I love who are in this messy middle of the spectrum between non-standard and precarious work. And in fact, I think I fathomed to guess that we all know somebody in this space, and perhaps not on both spectrums, maybe not on just purely on the non-standard work and precarious spectrum, but it touches so many people in our lives, which makes this space to me a little bit of a dangerous and also unknown in terms of understanding who are the people who are most likely to slip through the cracks when it comes to the precarity and precarity that would be faced within this non-standard work arrangement. And it warrants us to ask what is happening in a society that has made this a reality for some, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. And I think the pandemic has really accentuated the dichotomy and the extremes of both ends of non-standard and standard, as well as precarious and decent work. So one thing I want to share here is our little graphic here that has been done by the Public Policy Forum, and I hope you can see it here. What really stood out to me is that when I think about precarity and non-standard work, I think it's not just a checklist. I think researchers have done a fantastic job in terms of highlighting the aspects and the elements of precarity and also non-standard work, but it's also, in a sense, a continuum. It's an area of movement. There's dynamic movement within it. And I think if we imagine it as movement and a transitory and maybe at times transitionary space, this can help us understand a little bit more in terms of who are we trying to talk with and who are we trying to work together alongside. I also just want to ground a little bit about the conversation today, just from my own standpoint of where I come from. My understanding, because I don't know the entire space of non-standard work and precarity, but as my work in this field is very much grounded as a migration and a labor scholar, and studying specifically the role of platform work, which is, you can define it as app-based labor platforms that facilitate the transaction of goods and services between individuals, and its role on impacts on migrants in Canada. So my research took me down a path of knowing and wanting to understand who are the people and why are they wanting to enter this space. And one of the most central themes I find the most fascinating, exciting for myself, is that non-standard and precarious work, especially in the platform work that situation that I'm studying, it's a symptom of our labor market, and not simply just a conversation we can have about how do we fix precarity. If we don't address first why are people entering it and what are the causes, and instead of challenging what are the systemic barriers that have hindered mobility in some ways for one to transition in and out of the space. So in order to explore who is entering, it also makes me wonder who are people wanting to get out and who find themselves left behind the space. So I'll leave that one slide there, but I'll keep on going. And one of the things I really loved about working on this is also the case studies that accompany this. And as a researcher, I always want to center around the voices of those who are impacted in this work. And in the case studies written by Kathleen Leatham, there are many themes of precarity that are voiced in the non-standard workers that she interviewed, but there are two specific quotes that stood out to me, and I kind of want to use that as setting the stage for our conversation today. First, we heard from Jody, who is a personal support worker, and she said, I work up to 120 hours every 2 weeks. I have a mortgage I have to pay. I have all the vehicle costs I have to pay for. I have to put food in my mouth. There's just not enough money coming in. And secondly, we heard from Ahmed, who is a food courier platform worker. And he said, there's nobody to protect you or help you. There are no benefits at all. They don't see you like other industries. They call you a freelancer or contractor, so you don't have any rights as an employee. Why it was so important for me to reflect on this is I think it's also important to notice the visible and invisible sectors of non-standard and precarious work. So at times we notice potentially the gig worker or the platform worker who delivers food to the door, but in Jody's case, perhaps a personal support worker who's doing such important and crucial work, especially during the pandemic. Some occupations are rendered invisible, hidden behind institutions or hidden behind homes, and they cannot be neglected. And I think when it comes to policy recommendations, how important it is to really have to take a step back and look at, are we actually capturing what all forms of non-standard working arrangements and who are the ones that might be a little bit more hidden? So we may all have our own ideas of the non-standard precarious worker, but it could be even ones with an employer. So perhaps a temporary grocery worker that we see, or the international students who are bounded by only a certain number of hours they can work and are forced to make arrangements to make their ends meet. And there are just various other seasonal, casual, temporary working arrangements in this non-standard space. So before we make, again, recommendations, I think this is one of the really key factors that I really want to dig into is these invisible and visible sectors that we may not be seeing all the time. Another thing that really drew to me when I was writing this article, and I don't want to regurgitate what is in the space was written already. So I want to bring up some key questions that have informed my own curiosity when I was writing. The first question that really drew to me was, who is moving in and out of non-standard precarious work, and who is being recruited to fill the demand? So I think this touches upon the aspect of data as one of the huge over-encompassing recommendation that is made there in our piece, but it's understanding what are we doing as a country right now to measure non-standard forms of work, and are we taking enough of a proactive stance on it? And I know Lori and Sherry touched upon this before on the data-driven metrics and the necessity of it. I was reading a recent article in the Globe and Mail about how do you measure casual work, and one of the interviewees they quoted that a lot of labor market surveys currently ask, do you have a job? But instead, shouldn't we be asking, what's the main ways that you're making money? So even those nuances of capturing the various facets of income making possibilities can help us understand a little bit more about what non-standard work is looking like right now. And in many parts of the world, including Canada, I believe we have a very piecemeal version of data collection. We capture some through administrative data, some through labor market surveys. But when we want to think about the entire supply and demand of workers in this space that are oftentimes migrants, people who have difficulty assessing job opportunities, racialized individuals, women, youth. When we want to capture all these aspects here, I think there needs to be more proactive and longitudinal data instead of just capturing at one standpoint what's happening here. We need to keep track of constantly what are the reasons, what are the attitudes, what are the predicaments that are rendering individuals to fall into space here. And also capturing what is one's perception versus reality when it comes to working here, whether it has matched up. So perhaps if I go into this job thinking it's flexible, is it still exactly what I thought it was in my head when I started? I think these are some conversations and importance of understanding the real work and lived experience of workers in this field. Around data, in addition to making solid policy recommendations, it also must be remembered that data has potential to even exploit the most vulnerable and those in most need of protection. And especially during the pandemic, we have seen how the opaque nature of certain platforms have been exploiting workers in which they don't know how their pay, how their tips are working. And I think this is very important when it comes to understanding how data also needs to be carefully curated, and also how, when it comes to workers in this space, how it could potentially lead to further exploitation and extraction of their personal information and data. The second question that I want to pose was, how can we move beyond an either-or mindset? So yesterday's session with Jerry and Ed, I remember one of the questions towards the end was asking about the role of gig work and unions. And I love that question. And Jerry made a point that stood out to me, was that perhaps for those who seek full flexibility are in the minority, but they're not necessarily the majority of people who fully want a flexible schedule and absolutely no reins. And the majority still seek good jobs and potentially full-time work. I think that's an important reality to consider, especially who is the majority, who's the minority, and to question. And it brings me to examine and question a world where maybe there doesn't need to be an either or sort of term, where we don't have to contrast equity with efficiency, or opposing regulation and rigidity to deregulation and flexibility. And I think these conversations can link to portable benefits, which we will discuss and has been discussed in our case studies, in which the benefits are tied to the employee rather to the employer. And therefore, it can enable the employees to have more power to transition jobs if they seek. Employees also, there has been other innovations for employees. And I think another one that stood out to me was in Latin America, with the influx of Venezuelan migrants working in neighboring countries like Argentina or Chile. Social enterprises are stepping up to the plate to provide health services, legal advice, or financial advice to workers who seek to use gig work as a transitory space, but they want to move beyond that. And these social enterprises are working through membership or sponsorship or government funding to support gig workers. And these are some of the ideas that have given me sort of hope to be able to see that there are other people that can be doing this work. All to say, however, that is a cautionary note that we should still not take the responsibility and the burden of responsibility away from those who are exploiting workers. And while civil society is very important to play a part in here, and me and you can all play a part here, we still have to hold those exploiters in account and hold responsible. Lastly, the question that of how can we move non-standard and precarious work from becoming the best alternative? This is one narrative I hear a lot from our research and those conversations of those in precarious jobs. And it's that this is the best job available to me, or this is the best survival job that I have. How can we help those who want to leave the space transition? What are the tools that can be support? So in my study of migrants in Canada, there is a shift towards task-oriented or skill-oriented approaches for workers to note that they can in fact be able to move, and they're not necessarily having to stay stagnant in a certain job. Such as the Immigrant Employment Council of British Columbia, they have this tool called FAST, that kind of moves towards looking beyond job qualifications and what looks good on paper, but actually into real skills. And secondly, as we talk about EI revamps of employment insurance that is going on post-pandemic, there are conversations of how can we look at support systems like a targeted basic income, for example, that can support an alternative income source during times of crisis. While these are not cure-alls, I think that it has to be complemented with basic services such as extended health supplements to low-income individuals in order to provide this mutually beneficial community that we can all work and live in. To end, I know there's the whole space of non-standard work and precarity. It seems like an abyss, and there's really no panacea for all of this. But as we talk about the future of work and what can we envision a reality where precarity might not need to be the default expectation? And I think that's the dream here. And I really do see hope in it. I see a lot of work that's needed. It takes a lot of knowing of the people who are in the space. I need to know the reasons of work in the space and also a lot of intersecting policy regimes that are in play. It also takes cooperation from employers, not-for-profits, social enterprises to challenge ideas that there is a trade-off between benefits and flexibility. And I want to imagine a reality where Ahmed and Jody can live and have work with informed choices of what they want to do without fearing that they have to put their livelihoods and their lives at risk. So thank you for your time today, and I look forward to the discussion to come. And now I want to welcome Jeanette on the stage.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everybody. First, let me just say thank you to Public Policy Forum for having me participate in the Brave New Work Conference and have a discussion about this thing you're calling the messy middle and precarity in non-standard work and the gig economy and some correlations, some thoughts that I've sort of been thinking about through Laura's paper. So that, that's been a really great thing, and it's really sparked a lot of thinking for me that isn't going to stop for a very long time. But before I launch into my tirade of thoughts, let me just first, for the audience, introduce myself. So as you know, my name is Jeanette Campbell, and I am the CEO of the Ontario Disability Employment Network, which is also known as ODEN. I'm actually right now seated in my home office in an office chair. I have a bookshelf and I have a lamp behind me. I am wearing a gray and black suit, although it might not be obvious that I dressed up for this event. And I have pulled back curly hair. I am technically a middle-aged woman, although I believe I look about 15. So just so I can describe myself for anybody who benefits from that. So I'm also, before I really launch into this idea around navigating precarity, I just want to touch on a couple of quick facts because disability is often left out of a lot of conversations. Sometimes intentionally because it's a very big topic, and oftentimes unintentionally it can be overlooked, but it's really important. So I just want to sort of put some general statistics and information out there first. So in Canada, we know as of the latest stats, 22% of the Canadian population identifies as being a person who has one or more disabilities. In that same round of statistics, we're looking at about 59% of working age adults who identify with one or more disabilities being employed. And that's compared to approximately 80% of people who don't apply, who don't identify as having a disability. But it's important to note that as the impact, or sometimes the terminology is severity, of disability increases, and those percentages fall greatly. So your interaction and your engagement in the world of work decreases significantly the more impact or affect that your disability has. And lastly, really related to, you'll see how the bouncing ball connects in a minute, the after-tax personal income for people who have a disability is considerably lower, and for women who have a disability also much considerably lower as well. So I want to reflect now on, so that's just setting a bit of a stage. I want to reflect on some of the things that made me really cheer in Laura's paper, and that's around her call to action around data and the need for data. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking about this topic and searching for data, and there isn't any. Well, I won't say there isn't any. There's not a lot. And there's not a lot of Canadian-based data either. So I think that, we have this opportunity to move forward and start to collect data and start to inform potential policies, legislation, make recommendations. And so when we consider anything that's going to happen in the non-standard work or the precarious gig economy, the research and data collection really does need to be inclusive of workers who have a disability. A lot of that too is because precarious work is very common. It's commonplace for this population. There's a multitude of reasons for that, but one of the big ones that we're seeing right now through this pandemic is that there is there's an overrepresentation of people who have a disability in certain sectors, one of them being the service sector, which has been so incredibly affected by this pandemic. And it's always been a very precarious sector to be in. So that's problematic. So, there's a lot to learn about the benefits and challenges of gig work from the disability community, and learnings that I feel pretty strongly need to really be applied to any future planning when we talk about standardization or stabilization or solutions that are going to support people as they move in and out of this new way of working. So, there's benefits. Let's chat briefly about that. There's lots of benefits to non-standard work. There's lots of benefits to the gig economy, depending on the type of work, especially, such as the idea that you have much better control over your schedule, and greater control of when or how your tasks are being completed or performed. So if you're a person who has episodic disabilities, or would be able to bring more of your authentic self to your jobs, if you can work from home or have that level of flexibility, this is really great. You can build accommodations how you see fit around in and around the work that you're doing. You can implement non-traditional accommodations that don't always fit into the standard world of work. So if you want a personal support worker to help you with some of your tasks, or you engage a friend, or you contract out your work in parts and you supervise it, these are all things that don't normally land really well in the world of standard office work or standard world of work. Also, the thoughts around there's a potential for less discrimination. I mean, we'll put it out there. There's discrimination, and for all people, and when you move into the world of having to do disclosure in order to access accommodations and things like that, you are putting yourself in a precarious situation in standard work at times, depending on who your employer is and how well versed they are, and how willing they are to accommodate and make it an inclusive and diverse culture that you're working in. And then lastly, and I mean, there's lots of benefits, but I'll just say that this access to a second income or higher income is of great benefit. The poverty levels, like I said, for people who are employed and people who are unemployed, who identify as having a disability, is significantly higher. And that access to a second income is fabulous. But there's some challenges that are identified. And some of the speakers have touched on this a little bit, and so I'll frame this in a disability landscape. So workers or students or job seekers who have a disability often experience higher barriers to training, to education in the education system, than to effective cooperatives and internship programs. And so that means less ability to gain experience and transferable skills, access to capital, That's referenced actually in Laura's paper in section recommendation number 4. She touches on this concept around privilege and access to capital being more helping you to be more successful in a gig economy. So you know, if the access to capital that's often needed to be more successful is often lower, and especially when you look at things like income and poverty rates. So building that wealth and capital behind you and creating those social networks and career networks. So also in the gig economy, accommodations can be really unregulated. In a lot of cases. So there's lacking legislation that enables access to opportunity. So the first thing that comes to mind, and the one example I found in my research, is around ride-hailing platforms, and the differences in accepting drivers who use modified vehicles. So there's no standardized rules or regulations there. So if you're a person who has a modified vehicle, you may or may not, depending on what country you're in or even what province you're in, and be able to do that as your career choice and enter into the economy there. And then there's, lastly, there's some systemic barriers. So right now in Ontario, we're going through what we call employment transformation. And that employment transformation is designed around standard work, that definition of standard work. So in the gig or the non-standard world, there's often things like fluctuating hours, inconsistent hours. You may have concentrated work at the beginning of a month and then nothing at the end of the month, because it's up to you to decide and design how you do that. But our system is designed to not acknowledge work under 20 hours, under a 20-hour threshold for employment service providers and the systems that are there to be able to support you. So we're creating some systemic problems there around potentially cutting off access for people to have support to enter into the gig economy, because the employment system designed to help actually can't or is not rewarded or compensated for the work that they're doing if the work falls underneath that threshold. And then lastly, around this great opportunity to have a second income or increase your income in and out of times, if you are a person who at times relies on the social assistance system or some disability tax credits, access to enhanced drug cards, things like that, there's an overwhelming administrative burden that could be part of this. And also because of the fluctuations, again, your income may rise up and down, which can put you into a very precarious situation with the very safety social net that's been put in place to help all of us as we try to move out of poverty. So I'm going to leave my thoughts there, and I'm going to introduce Alex Mazer to the stage. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thanks very much, Jeanette, for those comments, and also to Laura. And I'm going to talk about this idea of portable benefits, which is covered in Laura's paper. And what I'm going to try and do is to give some real world examples of portable benefits, because it's one of these ideas that's often very conceptual and people have a hard time getting their head around, you know, how would that actually work in practice? So that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm really glad to be here. I mean, just to give the context of where I'm coming from, I'm a co-founder of a company called Commonwealth, which is a mission-driven business based on solving what we see as a very large public problem. And that problem is the lack of retirement security for the 10 million Canadians that don't have access to a workplace retirement plan. I have a public policy background. So does my co-founder, Jonathan. We've been running the business since 2015. And we're very passionate about participating in public policy discussions like this because we see it as our responsibility as a business to help improve, not only do a good job for our own customers, but try and improve the retirement system, which is a system that includes a lot of public policy elements, not only specific to retirement, but also specific to workplace benefits. So very grateful to the Public Policy Forum for creating this opportunity for cross-sectoral dialogue. And hopefully I can bring a bit of a perspective from a startup, a fintech company, a mission-driven private sector provider that's trying to work with partners to solve a very big problem. So I was reflecting on Laura's paper, and one of the ideas I was thinking about was the idea of, you know, precarity on the one hand. You could think about the opposite of precarity being security. And we often think in terms of job, right? We think job precarity and job security. But the other side that we need to think about is the financial side. So with the contrast being financial precarity and financial security. And there may be situations where it's difficult for us to do that much to help with the precarity of the job. And maybe people actually want some degree of flexibility, but there are some things we can do to help improve the financial security of the person. And the problem is we've created a society in which often job precarity goes hand in hand with financial precarity, where people are living paycheck to paycheck, where they don't have benefits at work. And we need to create a world, and we believe very strongly in this, that no matter how you choose to work, you have access to some degree of financial security, some degree of benefit security, and that we create a more level playing field between people that have a traditional standard employment with a large employer, and therefore have access to a wide suite of benefits and financial security, likely, and those who work in a very different situation, whether it's as a non-standard worker or for a smaller employer, a small business, and don't have access to a lot of those different kinds of benefits. So, to share a couple stats with you, about half of Canadians, it depends on the type of benefit and depends on the data that you use, but roughly half Canadians don't have any type of retirement coverage at work. And that's pretty similar stats if you look across other different kinds of benefits as well, whether they're dental and health coverage, whether it's things like life insurance and disability insurance. There's about half the population that is left out of the systems of financial security. And so part of the question of portable benefits is how can you create a system where everybody has access to benefits that are portable and connected to the worker, as we talked about, but it's not just the portability. It's also the idea that these are high quality benefits that are going to actually, really help people establish that level of financial security for that type of worker. When you look at the data about who has retirement plan coverage, which is the area that we know about, it breaks into a few different groups. It's predominantly people that are more likely to be modest income. It's people who work for small or medium-sized employers are much less likely to have a plan. It's people that are in non-standard work, as we discussed, the self-employed. And it's predominantly, there's more and more data coming out about this, but there was a really interesting paper last week from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives about the racial and gender inequities between white Canadians on the one hand and racialized and Indigenous Canadians on the other hand when it comes to retirement security. And we're seeing very big gaps there as well. So that's, the population that we're aiming to try and help is those that don't have coverage, and it's a very big problem. So I want to give a couple of examples that are covered in the case studies, but provide a little more color on these examples of some of the work that we've been doing. So I want to start to go back to Jody's story, the personal support worker that's highlighted in the case example that Catherine so ably wrote up. And Jody is a member of a union that we've been working with for a number of years called SEIU Healthcare. They represent many frontline healthcare workers, about 60,000 frontline healthcare workers, predominantly in Ontario. And we started working together because most of those frontline healthcare workers that were working in home and community care, personal support workers who are making, on average, probably roughly about $30,000 or $35,000 a year, did not have any retirement benefits at work. And so what we did in collaboration with the union is create a program, a portable program for those members and their spouses that would give them access to some kind of retirement security, a high quality plan, and it's also tailored to the needs of modest income workers. And the way that works is a couple things. Number one is the union works to oversee the plan. They work to bargain the plan collectively with home care providers and other employers to encourage them to make matching contributions into the plan. And we've also designed the plan so that it works well together with our system of government benefits. Because for that type of worker, most of their retirement income is going to come from programs like the Guaranteed Income Supplement, Old Age Security, and the Canada Pension Plan. And so this savings program is really a supplementary savings program. And we use the tax-free savings account because it is much more efficient than an RSP or a pension plan and allowing people to preserve their guaranteed income supplement in retirement. So it's really tailor-made for those who are working on more modest incomes, who are just starting their savings journey, and they want to make those dollars that they save, which are actually really difficult to put aside because they've got many other needs. As Laura pointed out in that quote from Jody, we want to make sure those dollars go as far as possible. We've done modeling on this. Depending on how you design a plan, you can have a plan that's 3 to 4 times more efficient in terms of how much retirement income is generated for every dollar that's saved. And that is a massive difference if you think about the lifetime value of that for an average worker, like a personal support worker or many of the other workers who work in frontline healthcare and don't have the benefit of a good pension plan or a good retirement benefit at work. So that's a story of how a union can play a leadership role in setting up a plan like that. You can read the case study with some great quotes from Tyler Downey, who's the Secretary Treasurer of SEIU and has been spearheading much of the effort from the union side to get that plan in front of as many workers as possible, to get employers on board and to make sure it's run in the best interests of plan members. Great example of how the labor movement can play a role in expanding access to benefits for a group of workers that may not be non-standard workers, but they are certainly precarious workers in terms of how they're paid and their work conditions. The other example that I wanted to share is an initiative called the Common Good Retirement Plan. And this is an initiative, it's a very collaborative national initiative amongst a variety of philanthropic foundations, not-for-profit leaders, not-for-profit employers, and ourselves, who've really come together to say, how do we create a plan that's portable for charities and not-for-profits in this country that do not have retirement benefits? There are about 850,000 not-for-profit workers that don't have a retirement plan through their work. Many of them are small organizations, they're local organizations. We're talking about Boys and Girls Clubs, women's shelters, environmental NGOs, and there are many fantastic not-for-profits across the country that don't really have the scale in some cases to offer high-quality benefits. So this whole idea was, can we use the scale of the sector? Can we kind of come together to create a program, and we call it Common Good, to allow those not-for-profits to access a high-quality retirement program that's, again, tailored to the needs of those folks. We spent about 2.5 years doing consultations, doing research, consulting with world-class experts in retirement plan design, doing roundtables across the country. We have a steering committee comprised of not-for-profit sector leaders. We have a champions council of people from across the country that are committed to promoting high-quality retirement benefits at work. And we've just launched this program officially about 2 months ago. And we're bringing on employers. I think we now have employers from 12 provinces and territories that are involved in the program, literally from St. John's to the West Coast to, I think we've got an employer in Pangerton, Nunavut as well. So it's fantastic to see. It's still very early days in terms of how this program is going to operate, but it's called the Common Good Plan. And it's an interesting example of a sectoral portable benefit that's being offered to smaller employers and people that haven't traditionally had access to those benefits. So those are a couple of case examples. I just wanted to close with a couple of ideas just to seed for what government might do. So the examples I've shared are examples of social purpose organizations, business coming together to create examples of portable benefits. But we really need to scale this up because we're talking about over 10 million Canadians that don't have access to high quality benefits. Automatic enrollment is one thing that's been used very successfully in the area of retirement to allow more people to get access to benefits. It's something we should look at. Funding for innovation in this area. Many of the organizations that could play a role here do not have the funding to take initiatives, and that would be very helpful. And then lastly, incentives for both modest income people to save or to purchase insurance in the case of benefits, or for smaller employers or other organizations that are linked to non-standard workers to set up these kinds of programs, are things that have been used successfully elsewhere. So those are potential public policy levers. I know we're out of time, or I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop it there and look forward to the questions.
Fantastic, Alex. Thank you so much. We could go on, I think, for a while, but we've got several questions from the audience, some of which are directed directly at you. But I'd like to invite Laura and Jeanette back to the stage just for the last 5 minutes or so to answer a couple of these audience questions. So we've heard a lot about, Jeanette, you talked about the opportunities that non-standard work could present, especially for workers who are traditionally or systematically excluded from a lot of standard work arrangements, and the lessons that non-standard work might present for standard work to be improved for those people. It sounds like there are lots of kind of individual elements of a social safety net that might need to be bolstered in order for us to take advantage of those opportunities. And I think the program that Alex was just talking about and your whole company is one element of that. But we've got a great question here about the role of government. And, you know, a few of you talked about, I think, Laura, you mentioned the rise of social enterprises that are filling the gap. And Alex, I think you probably fit in that category. Is the desired end state here to close that gap by government? Is it sustainable to be relying on social enterprises to fill that gap? And maybe this is an unfair question for you, Alex, but do you see a future world where companies like yours don't need to exist because there are kind of larger systems in place to serve that need?
Look, I think there is a very important role for government in addressing the problem that we work on, which is the problem of retirement security and more broadly the role of benefit insecurity. And I don't think that our governments have paid enough attention to this issue. I think the pandemic hopefully has brought more attention to financial insecurity as an issue, and I'm hoping that we'll see, you know, some more change come out of that. When you look at the metrics of what makes for a healthy retirement system, I'll just take our industry. It's not something that's run entirely by government. There's no retirement system in the world that's been successful that's run entirely by government. The most successful ones are a mix of strong government regulation and public pensions on the one hand, and then a well-regulated private market combined with employers, unions, and other participants. So it's an ecosystem that we need to think about. But I do think there's a stronger role for government in expanding coverage when it comes to benefits for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That touches on another question on kind of a similar vein here about who should bear the responsibility for ensuring that all workers benefit from financial security, whether that's a division of responsibility just between employers and governments, or whether there might be other players who have a role there. And I don't know, Laura, do you have kind of any insight on who else needs to be part of this conversation?
Yeah, so I think touching upon government obviously was a huge important factor, but also in terms of like social enterprise, we touched upon that. But one element I've been thinking a lot about is the role of different forms of government. And I think when I think about the government, we think about, okay, the Ministry of Labor has to do these all-encompassing policies, but what's the role of local municipal government in regulating non-standard work, or in the sense of gig economy? Let's talk about platform workers. What can be done within each specific city that is tailored towards the demographics of the community? Because I think it's all different. I think it's different. I don't think we can have like this one blanket statement that can fix all of Canada's problems. So that's one area that I would encourage more research, and I would love to think more and have more conversations about.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate that. We're getting to the end of our time here, but if you'll indulge me, I'll just go a minute or two over. I want to ask the group, and maybe especially Jeanette, from where you sit, your experience. You know, we've talked a lot about who, and Laura, you framed it really well, who winds up in non-standard or precarious work situations, and why do they end up there? And I think what we've seen is that it's predominantly or over representing people with diverse identities, and especially facing complex intersectional barriers to work. And Jeanette, that's something that you brought up a little bit, especially from the perspective of workers with disabilities, but other intersectional identities as well being affected or being overrepresented in precarious situations. And I wonder, as we talk about the social safety net that can be kind of pieced together to help support them, is there anything that you see as missing from this conversation, aside from kind of the retirement benefits that we've been talking about and the financial security? What else do you think we need to be thinking about?
Well, Andre, you only have 2 minutes, so I'll just say that anytime that we look at life stabilization supports, which is really sort of what we're talking about, there are multiple conversations going on, basic guaranteed incomes, financial literacy, opportunities for access to different products for savings so that it's a personal responsibility, legislation around the unbanked to protect people from that sort of fringe banking financial world. So I think that, you know, to Laura's point, we need to look at all the different levels of government involved in this, creating policies that actually have bite, and helping to create systems that will pull the expertise out of the communities that these products and safeguards and life stabilization supports are there to help. And I think when we do that, then everybody's gonna be better.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I threw the hardball question and you very succinctly wrapped it up for us. I think we'll leave it on that note. Thank you so much, Jeanette. And big thanks to you, Laura and Alex, for sharing your research and your experience in navigating precarity and non-standard work and helping others do the same. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us.